Greetings on this Tuesday of Easter week, the active of Easter, as we move into the 50 days of the Easter feast in our church. We wonder where these 50 days, how that was determined, and it's good to remember that it came from the Jewish feast of Pentecost. It was a harvest festival that the Jewish people had after the Passover, 50 days after the Passover, and the Christian community embraced that and called it the 50 days of Easter, moving toward the Feast of Pentecost. We listened to the scriptures today, the story about Mary Magdalene, important to remember herself also as among the women disciples who traveled with Jesus. Mentioned earlier as a woman who was cured of many demons. Some misinterpreted that as being cured of many sins, when actually what it meant was being cured of serious illnesses. So that Mary was one of the folks who was at the crucifixion. Mary was one of the people who went to the tomb, and lots of lessons to learn from her in this gospel today. In her darkest hour, losing her dearest friend, she experienced the risen Christ, the resurrection, and the transformation. Her persistence is something that's a lesson for us to learn and to think about. It reminded me of someone I think about every once in a while, Sister Simone Campbell. She's a lawyer and a lobbyist in District of Columbia. She was one of the nuns on the bus. She's the one who does lobbying in Washington for economic justice, immigration reform, and health care and ecology, among other things. What I remember her saying is, don't run away from conflict or difficulty, go straight into it. Lots of courage, a woman of her caliber and character. But it's a good lesson. Being touched by the risen Christ, by Jesus calling her name, Mary, she was able to see him, to experience him very differently than how she had expected to see him. Mary was transformed from the anguish of death to the empowerment by the risen Christ to be the first evangelist, the first to proclaim the resurrection, and so our own resurrection after death. And her proclamation of this new life spoke of the reconciliation of the whole world through the pure love of Christ given to us by God. What are our lessons? Many among them are moments of ongoing transformation, part of our lives as members of the church, as God's daughters and sons. Many possible questions we might ask ourselves. Is there something that I've been holding on to that I can let go of and experience more fully in my life? Wonder if there has been a time when I heard my name being called in the midst of a loss or a struggle, a call that helped me to see differently what I was experiencing. I might ask myself, we might ask ourselves, if there's a time when we have found strength to stay in a painful moment rather than to run away, which might have been our temptation. Is there something that the pandemic has made me keenly aware of, something that I will value more now than I have before? I suspect that that's a good question for all of us. Many of us have been considering what will happen after the pandemic. Today, friends, we pray for those who experienced loss in the pandemic itself. We pray for our elected officials that they will do all they can to help. We pray for those experiencing great stress and staying in place. We do indeed pray for all of us to experience the power and the strength of the risen Christ, our risen Lord. Blessings to all.